There we go. And welcome to those of you joining us on YouTube. We want to thank Itasca Bank for sponsoring this webinar. Sponsors like Itasca Bank help us to keep these webinars free for everybody. Contact me for more information on sponsoring. And you can also help keep these webinars free. After this webinar, you'll be taken to a page with a bunch of resources, including things you might be interested in, like our native plant guide, rain barrel information, our upcoming plant sale, and so much more, including our virtual tip jar. So if you're enjoying these webinars, please donate to help to keep TCF doing all the wonderful things that we do. You can also check the box and become a member, and then you can enjoy our wide variety of members only stuff as well. And with 2022 being the 50th anniversary of the Conservation Foundation, we've got some really awesome things coming up, such as our 50 miles for 50 years campaign, all kinds of things like that. So a lot of great stuff there. So follow us on Facebook, follow us on all the social medias to find out more information on that. So thank you all. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my new friend, Michelle Catania. Got that right? Okay. And take it away, Michelle.
Thank you, Jamie. And let's see where we're at. It did exactly what I didn't want it to do. I don't know why it's not playing nice right now. All right. It's in the bizarre function. Do you see my mouse moving on the screen?
Yes, I do. I see your notes panel
moving?
though too. This is like the speaker format. We had it just a minute ago.
Is this working?
Yes. Yeah, I can see your mouse. But that's the speaker format.
I'm sorry, what was that?
That's the speaker format, the speaker view.
But do you see, so do you see, that's what I'm trying, I had it before, now it's not working, and I don't know why it's not working, and it's pretty weird. I've never, just F5 is now, it's turning my volume down.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, that's why F5 is just present. That's why I'm like, this isn't my first rodeo.
No, and I 5 minutes ago we had this.
Okay.
There you go. That's it.
Is it working now?
Yes, now it's working.
You see this full screen with my mouse moving on the tree?
Yes. All good.
All right, I'm going to assume you can. I haven't heard otherwise. So my name is Michelle Catania. I'm the research coordinator for the Gateway to Tree Science at the Morton Arboretum. I've been there for 13 years. The first 10 years I spent in the soil science lab. I worked for researchers such as Dr. Bryant Sharonbrock. His focus was urban soils and how to amend them so that way urban trees can perform better in them. One of the leading causes of tree mortality in our built environment is poor soil, and it's evident by what the canopy looks like. A lot of people just look above ground and think, oh, these are above ground issues, but a lot of those above ground issues are a direct reflection of what's happening below ground. So what this talk is going to go into is the specific purpose of soil and how we can use soils to help, keep these trees going stronger and living healthier lives. All right, so the talk outline I'm going to talk about was tree growth and longevity. How much of it is site related? How can we help? And then we still have to know what the fundamentals are. What is soil? Like, how are they formed? What makes for healthy soil? What are the relationships between soils and plant communities? And then what the goal is, being that we're mostly in these urban environments, is urban soils are different. What are they? Why are they different? Why should we mitigate disturbed soils to help these trees perform to their maximum capacity? Doing a site assessment is really important. So I'm going to show you some of the tricks of the trade. We're going to look at some differences between urban and native soils, also compacted and non-compacted soils. And then I'll take you through some recent peer-reviewed research on improving these conditions. All right, so this is a death spiral. So the one on the left is taken from ecology and nature. So you get a healthy tree, and how it dies is, just time moves on, competition. You can get out of the death spiral by competition, but let's continue on in the death spiral. We go through a period of suppression. You can also have a period of release, but what happens is you just start stressing this tree out. Defoliation happens. You can have recovery. But let's just say now the beetles come in and now they're defoliating even more, you get fungus and you spiral into death. Well, we can do the same thing with these urban trees. So we have a healthy tree, it's a little bit of time moves on. Oh, commercial planting site, it's outgrown its planting site. So you can fix that if you do if you intervene and do some management practices. But let's continue on. Root space limitations is huge. That's one of the biggest issues with soil volume. So you can apply plant growth regulators to slow the growth down, or we can continue on. You get chlorotic, you start to get scale. With an intensive plant healthcare program, you can still salvage this tree, but again, it's salvaging a tree, which isn't a very good, healthy term to use. And then eventually it's dead, and you have to remove it because dead trees in the urban environment are actually a hazard to have. So this is what we see. This is what I see when I see urban trees, is I just see this downward spiral. So we're trying to fix this. So in 2019, Hilbert down at University of Florida did her PhD work on this exact subject. And what she did is she did a review of 56 studies, mostly from the United States, 41 from the US, 3 Canada, 3 in China. From the all research published from 1979 to 2017. She looked at how trees were grown, when they died, when symptoms started happening, and she created this normalship curve. So what we have is at 0 is years since planting. So 0, 5, 10, 15 years of planting on the x-axis, and on the y is percent survivorship. So looking at 50% survivorship is this dotted line. We have 3 lines coming in. I have my better than normal survivorship. Those are really great, healthy trees. So you can see I would get to about 50% mortality at a really decent age for an urban tree. We're looking at 37 to 33 years for a better than normal tree to have a 50% mortality rate. All right, well, more often than not, we're in the middle of the road. So again, at 100% survival, we start approaching our 50% survival rate much sooner than the better than. And if you come down to the y-axis, you're looking at a 17 to 13 year range. And then these are the trees that really need some help, and they just steep dive into death at about a range of 10 to 7 years. So within all these 56 studies, the most common biophysical factor associated with mortality was taxa, tree size, age, and site characteristics. All right, so that I would say is compacted soils or lack of any sort of mulch or anything that you would emulate from the forest floor lacking from this environment. The most common human related factors were lack of stewardship, poor maintenance, and then vandalism. There's nothing that we can do for vandalism. But in 2020, the Arboretum set out to do our 10-year tree census. We did it in 2010, and we went back and did it in 2020. We went to all 7 counties. We inventoried 172 million trees. There was 157 million in 2010, so we saw a bit of an increase. They have an annual ecosystem service of $416 million. Canopy coverage actually went up 2% in 2020 versus 21% in the year 2010. There was 194 different species and 103 in Chicago, which is surprising. They had pretty high diversity rates. Of all those trees, 37% are native to Illinois. We saw a 46% decrease in ash trees. We lost 6 million ash trees from the Emerald Ash Borer. That's a definite decline in our tree coverage. So what we can see is these are the counties: Cook, DuPage, Kane, Kendall, Lake, McHenry, the number of trees in each area, the acreage of those trees, and the trees per acre. So it makes sense that we're going to have really high density in counties like Lake, where they have a lot more forest cover. Whereas these fringe counties that are, that you're on the edge of agriculture, such as Will, Kendall, Kane, McHenry, we're going to see a little bit different. Kendall County is 15 trees per acre, but we have a lot more farmland there. Those they do not merge well together. All right, so the tree and shrub canopy cover increased from 2010 to 2020 in 6 of the 7 counties, while the tree and shrub cover decreased in the city of Chicago and McHenry County. So here's the counties. The dark green is 2010, light green is 2020. And the y-axis is my percent canopy cover. So here you're looking at Lake County. They have exceeded themselves from their 2010. This is looking at all 7 counties minus Chicago. So what is the composition and structure of these forests? We are, as a Morton Arboretum, we're oak crazy. We love our oaks. It was really sad to see that oaks were only about 4% of the total trees. We're seeing a huge mortality rate going on with oaks in the area. They did account for 13% of leaf area, but that makes sense. They're big, they're mature. They're not this little tiny European buckthorn, which is the dominant tree in our urban forest of Chicago. So none of these are quality trees down here. You have European buckthorn, box elder, black cherry, and these are short-lived small trees. Mulberry, like these are things that we should not see in traditional forest surveys. Over here, the structure of Chicago is dominated by smaller trees. Where are my big trees? All of my trees are in the 1 to 6 inch diameter. That is unacceptable. This is not forest canopy. This is not part of our infrastructure. These are sticks that are going to sit there for 12, 13 years, like that normal ship, the low quality normal ship curve, and they're just going to die. We're not putting these trees into these higher classes, and a lot of it is site conditions. So with more canopy, we would have more benefit. You can see the decimation with green ash. We lost 5.2 million of them over those 10 years, 1.2 million white ash. That was a huge hit to our urban forest. And these were big trees. They had large canopies. They provided a lot of ecosystem services, whether with stormwater management or habitat. So how can we improve urban tree growth and longevity? We need to have a deeper understanding of soil quality attributes. And we do that by emulating the forest floor. You know, if you take yourself in a forest setting and you see it and you feel it and you smell it and you're like, I need to now put this in my front yard. We can work on that. We can get that, as opposed to these, you know, very compacted, manipulated landscapes that we typically have, especially after new building. So we'll understand how to identify these characteristics and how detrimental they could be to root development and exploration, leading to overall poor root growth, and how to apply science-based techniques to amend these sites. All right, so what is soil? Soil is a dynamic natural body composed of mineral, organic solids, liquids, gases, all serving plant growth. So this is the typical the topsoil. Topsoil has a lower bulk density than soils below it. So this is your top 12 inches of soil in the area. Half of it should be solid and half of it should be pore space. And that pore space can either fill with water or air, and both are vital for living organisms. You start filling this whole pore space with water, you have saturated soils. Now your aerobic bacteria start becoming anaerobic, which is what you start seeing in wetlands. So we can still work with that. We just have to plant the right tree there. We cannot put an upland tree in an area that you know is completely going to be waterlogged soil. And so it's another, more formal definition is a collection of natural bodies occupying the Earth's surface. It's capable of supporting plant growth and has properties resulting from the integrated effects of climate and living organisms that act upon this parent material, the geology. It's weather geology. And one of the biggest factors is it takes a long time. We have to give these soils the credit that they deserve. Our soils here are about 10 to 12,000 years old. So in a more simpler form, it's just unconsolidated, weathered, thick, variable zone of mineral and organic material. It's biologically active, and that's what separates soils on Earth from soils that could exist on other planets. So we have to make sure that the biology is there, and it covers most of the Earth's land surfaces. If anything, just remember that it's intensely weathered geologic materials. So we'll go over how they form. There's 5 soil forming factors, which lead to a soil profile development. And within these soil profiles, we have different properties that we can look at. And then we know these properties are related to the plant communities in which the soil is developed in. It's a loop, it's connected, it's natural. You cannot study one without the other. I started my career so I have a bachelor's in biology with an emphasis in plant science, and I wasn't satisfied with the fact that the biologist never told me what soil was. So then I did a master's in geography, and I took a lot of soils classes there. So it's this, made up degree I gave myself that allows me to have this really deep understanding of how important these two entities are. You cannot look at a plant community and not examine the soil, and vice versa. All right, so there's 5 soil forming factors. You need climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. All of these function to peel out different soil types. There's 12 soil orders that are defined throughout the world. These very influential countries get together and like, how are we doing? Do we need to put in a new soil order? They're currently working on an urban soil order because urban soils do not necessarily fall within any of these. Here's a very low developed soil. It's called an entasol. It happens a lot in floodplains where you're getting this constant new material put on it. The most weathered soil is an oxisol. Go to Georgia where there are these deep red soils. They're old soils. Here's us. We have alpha sols. These are soils that developed under our eastern deciduous forest, and mollisols. They developed under our deep rooting prairie plants. So Illinois soils, Wisconsin soils, we're in a pretty highly developed soil, but not overdeveloped. We still have a lot of capacity for growing, which is why we're mostly farmland in Illinois. So climate and temperature really impact it. So precipitation, this is the 22-inch rain line, runs right through like Nebraska. We are east of it where you get rain. We get a lot of rain. It goes in, and as it's moving through our soil column, it's further developing and weathering that geologic material. Temperature also plays a factor. If we were in the cold areas where we have 2 months of active weathering front, that's definitely going to weather material at a different rate than down in Florida where it rains just constantly. So organisms are very important. There's so many organisms at all different levels, things you can see, things you can't see, things that we probably don't even know about yet. So really organisms are important. They're the ones that are cycling the nutrients. Relief, where are you on the landscape? Are you on the top? Are you on a highly erodible shoulder slope? Are you in the valley? Where are you? That's going to impact how and what is happening to the depth of these soils, as well as material being moved. Excuse me. So parent material, that's the geologic source of the rock. Locally in Illinois, most of us is glacial deposited. So we have a lot of moraines, till, loess, and outwash. And you can kind of go through this at a different time on your own, but the geology is really important to understand. It's hard to distinguish the two, because again, it's just intensely weathered geologic material. And then time is something that I'm sure we could all understand, that when the glaciers receded, so this is the Chicago area. It's really hard to see the map, but here is clay till. Does anybody have clay soils? I do. I could, if there was a value for it, I could sell it. You get a little bit further out. These are the end moraines. This is the extent of the glacier that came down. And so you're just getting these massive deposits of different textured materials, very thick clay stuff. You'll get some lake deposits in here. It's a little bit more simpler view. It's less detailed, but we have all these different moraines and their materials. We know what is below the weathered material. So over time, you get this rock and weathering starts to happen. Rain, freeze, thaw events start cracking it. You start to get soil formation as plants come in, your lichens, your little early forbs and your herbaceous, and they just start manipulating the ground. They're by dropping leaves and having, their own fertilization, they're going to turn the soils into a more conducive environment. It's succession. So keep in mind, 1 inch of soil in our region took approximately 100 years to develop. And that's under natural conditions in natural plant communities, not our urban systems. So CLORP is something cute, that's climate organisms relief parent material in time. That leads to different soil horizons, which is called your soil profile. So you can, this is, if all soil profiles were in one, you would have an O horizon, which is not actually mineral. It's your leaf litter layer in the forest floor. You get topsoil over what could be an alluviated horizon, subsoil, parent material. Typically, what I find is A, B, C. All right, so O's you're going to find in a forest setting. E's you're going to find more in our northern hardwoods, not necessarily around here. But you also have these, you have things moving, right? You have minerals changing composition. If a little bit of acidity coming in on the rainwater, it's going to weather things, it's going to transform them. So it's this extremely complex process here. Just start digesting this thing. Over 1,000 years, you can get a centimeter of this soil, and it's looking at it where it is in the profile. You have losses, additions, transformations. This is chemical transformation. So things are happening and changing. What was once one thing is now untraceable. So there's some important soil properties that lead to soil health. You need to look at it as a physical, a chemical, and a biological program all working together to come up with this maximum capacity soil health. So you need to look at texture, structure, color, smell, pH, something called cation exchange capacity. That's its nutrient holding retention. Bulk density, that's the physical, how much material is in a given space. And that is completely correlated to pore space. So going back to that typical A horizon, it should be about 50% pore space. That's something I want you to keep in mind throughout all of this, that your typical A topsoil, top 12 inches of topsoil, should have about 50% pore space. So what's texture? Texture, a sandy soil feels gritty. A silty soil feels flowery. So this is taking the soil, putting it in your hand, rubbing it around, and you can feel the sand grains, you can feel the flowery, and you can get the sticky. But looking at how these particles are, look at how this is this large sand grain. This is a silt grain in comparison to that. And this insignificant dot is a clay particle. That's why clays are so sticky, because they're so small, they stick together, they have really high surface area, and that leads to high water capacity. Looking at this graph down here, on the Y is soil water content. So soil water capacity, how much can this soil hold, which is important when you need to get through a drought. And then here's the different soil texture classes. I said I have a clay loam soils. So I have an extremely high field capacity for storing water, but I have a very high permanent wilting point, because the problem with soil is this surface will hold water molecules. And if this surface wants to hold the water molecule, it will not release it to the plant. So if you have a very high surface area in a soil, you actually can starve a plant of water while the soil is wet. And it comes down to just the physics and adhesion, cohesion of water and how that interacts. So just keep that in mind. You could be like, I have really clay soils. It hasn't rained in a while. You need to figure out that, okay, watering is your best bet. So we can figure out where we are on this called a soil texture triangle. You can see how influential a little bit of clay is. This whole top of the triangle is suggesting that within 40% or more clay in my soil, I'm defined as a clay soil. Here's my silt fraction. So if I want to know what a clay loam is, it's within 60 to 75% silt and 20 to 45% sand that's on the bottom. So you only really need to know two of your elements. So if you did there's this stuff called field texture, you can figure it out in the field. So what you do is you can start, this is available online. I can also send it, and we can send it out to you, but you can figure out the soil texture by playing with a wad of soil, rolling it up, making ribbons, going through this diagram and be like, okay, here I am. I'm coming out down here. I don't even screw around with these top things in my backyard, because I know I'm in a silty clay. But there's areas that do have high sand here. I was dealing with University of Chicago, and they are in a sand very sandy soils. This is my favorite. I just discovered it the other day. I'm going to call this the chuck it at the wall method because I didn't have anything else to say it. But if you make a wad of it and if you throw it at a wall and if it disperses, it has more sand in it and is coarsely textured. Or if it hits it like a wet rag, it's probably got some clay in it. So I'm going to try that sometime. So going back to structure, so all these functions, so much clay, sand, silt, the biology in it, dead things are sticky, they act like glues, roots, everything, they make these aggregates. So those are the pieces of soil that if you take your soil and you look at it and it falls apart in these natural like clumps, that's called an aggregate. An aggregate is a composition of all this material into one. So we can have granular structure, which is ideal. Prismatic doesn't necessarily happen around here. Massive happens all the time after we compact it. So you can see very little bit of water actually can leave this system. Whereas granular has really good water infiltration, looking at these water drops on the picture. Single grain is sand. That would have very high water infiltration, right? So very low water holding capacity. That, there's an inverse relationship here. Blocky tends to happen in your subsoils, which tends to be the soils that are at the surface after a lot of construction events with a little bit of topsoil on top. Platy can happen and it is excruciatingly slow getting water through that. This will happen with compaction. So as these plate compactors pound on the soil, they're going to be creating very platy and massive structure. All right, so color, what does soil color tell us? Soil color is directly related to the organic matter in it. So organic matter is made up of living, dead, and the very dead. And then we also can get color from iron and manganese. Looking at this 5% organic matter, 80% of it is humus, that's very dead. Roots tend to be living, sometimes they're dead. There's a lot of high turnover in the fine root fraction. And then organisms, all the little critters that live in it. So looking at just where you are, it's like, okay, this stuff leads to what's called particulate organic matter. This is our long-term carbon storage in soils. And this is where you're getting this dark color from. So we're not getting the dark color from the roots or the organisms that are living or the humus. It needs to actually go into the cycle further and become what's called particulate organic matter. And it essentially coats these surfaces with this sticky, gooey, black stuff, and it's our organic matter. So Illinois has really dark soils in it, and you can take this and we can say, okay, so you would wet this. This person didn't do is get it wet. You always want soils wet because dry is not consistent, but wet is. And so coming down here, you can say the darkest soils in Illinois have organic matter content of about 10%. That's incredible. So color, if you are looking at your soil and like, whoa, I'm in this really light tan, you're probably at very low organic matter and you're probably in subsoil. So you could very well, I have been to many houses in DuPage County, newer builds. This is what they're calling topsoil. And I'm telling you, that's not topsoil. Topsoil should be black to really dark brown, especially given that it's in Illinois. So redox features. Redox features happen a lot in this state because it's a reduction in oxidation of those two minerals, iron and manganese. So it leads to so in areas where we have a lot of water moving up and down, like in our wetlands, in our floodplains, we can actually reduce and oxidize these elements to get these colors happening. So this is an area where you have oxygen and lack of oxygen occurring seasonally. So you get these features that, so if I saw this, I'd be like, you know what, this tends to be a very wet site, but it can also be a dry site. Whereas over here, where it's just gray and glade, and you're looking at this chart, this is wetland soil. Now, wetland could have been drained, but it still will leave this mark. So it's something, and then once a wetland, always a wetland. So keep that in mind. And it'll stink. These things emit sulfur. So take a forest floor soil, smell it. That's your baseline. That's what you want your forest, your urban soils to smell like. If they smell like a toilet, there's something wrong. All right, so pH and cation exchange capacity, we call it CEC. pH dramatically affects the availability of nutrients. When you're in this slightly acidic area, where this bar gets pinched, we have a reduction in the availability of phosphorus within that pH. pH is so important for all biology. So just a slight altercation in the pH can throw off your nutrient balance. If you think you have a nutrient imbalance, it's always a good idea to send a sample off for professional analysis. It's like $15 a sample. It could save you a lot of money in the long run. So cation exchange capacity. That's the ability for cations, which are positively charged elements, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. These are essential elements to plant growth and life. Well, if there's a lot of negatively charged particles on surface area on the soil particle, there's a lot of what we call parking spots for these things. If there's not a lot, there's not a lot of exchange that's available to happen. So pH will directly impact this. But keep in mind, sodium is a cation, and in these areas where we do a lot of salting, we can actually replace all of these beneficial cations with sodium, and then you have ruined the soils, and they're called sodic. So we have to be careful there. CEC is altered by organic matter and clays. Different types of clays are going to lead to different types of capacities. So in short, it indicates how well soils hold on to anything. And it can also relate us how difficult it is to release it. All right. So one of my favorite things to get across is bulk density. So weathered material, weathered geologic material, rocks are dense, but these have gone through 10, 15,000 years of weathering, so they're less dense, ideally about 50% pore space. After construction, you are not there. You are in a really high density environment. What we've done is we've compressed this top circle into something where we now in the same volume is packing in about 74% solids as opposed to 50%. That's a huge increase in material in the same given area. Well, where did our water holding capacity? We only have 25% here versus our 50 up here. Everything's reduced. So it's like having a brick. You're planting in a brick. Some bricks actually have lower bulk density than some soils that we've come across. You want it to be a sponge, all right? So you have low bulk density. It's pretty easy to get to that low bulk density in a high bulk density environment by adding the right materials. So one thing to keep in straight to in our environment where we're traditionally very wet soils, we have these like wetlands that we're all over the place. You want to understand, okay, what is my water infiltration? How does water move through my soil? Is it fast? If it's a sandy soil, it's coarse, water's going to drain quickly. If you're in what my area is, a very clay soils, you can go on a walk and the water's still going into these puddles. So just do it, digging a hole, filling it with some water, record the depth, and then give it 15 minutes. What's the depth change? Did the water move 1 inch? You have multiplied that number by 4 to get it up into 1 hour. So you will have poor drainage if it was less than 4 inches per hour. Excessive drainage happens in sandy soils if you have more than 4 inches per hour. The sweet spot is 4 to 8 inches per hour. But knowing these numbers, now you can pick a better tree, or you understand that you need to be a little bit more proactive on your watering regime and your irrigation. So it's just an understanding and then being able to apply that to your environment. All right. So again, soils and plants have co-evolved. You get this rock, you have your pioneer species come in, intermediate, climax. We tend to use these trees as our urban trees, but we tend to put it in these environments that after the bulldozers move away, we're planting these climax trees here and it's non-compatible. So we have developed in this prairie peninsula from Illinois, very dense forest that leads to what we said alpha sol soils, and then this prairie soil is a mollisol soil. So we're in this area where we're constantly flipping between the two. Our rivers tended to have the forest running through them, whereas the open areas outside of the rivers were mostly prairie. So mollisols are thick. They supported grass vegetation. That's where they developed in. They are the most productive soils in the world, which is why they've been converted to agriculture. And traditionally, it's about 21% of all American soils. Alpha soils under hardwood forests, they have pretty good capacity for nutrients. They are also very productive, and they're about 14% of all soils in the US. So that's just looking at a closer. So again, this is all 12 soil orders, but here they are in a more detailed map of Illinois. So inceptisols are areas that flood a lot. You're going to constantly have changes happening. So there we are. What's that? Why can't we map that? I mean, it's just Chicago. This is why we don't have soil maps necessarily for our region. There's no way of predicting what's there. We know more about the housing and the infrastructure than we can about the soil. We know it's probably degraded. All right, so what is urban soil? It's non-agricultural, it's man-made, it's greater than 50 centimeters thick, it's produced by mixing, filling, or contamination of land surface in urban and suburban areas. It's material that's been manipulated and used. And many of you be like, this would never be, like I had a new house built, it never looked like this. It might have. And then they level it, they get some topsoil imported, they put a little bit on it, they roll your sod up, and then it looks great. But in reality, it's not. This is the housing boom. It's one contractor. He's got this, he's ripping the whole area. It's just boom, 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 boom. And then they're done, they walk away. We can fix this though. If we know what it looks like below ground, before we even talk about trees, let's talk about amending the soil. So these soils appear ready to support healthy long-lived trees. I hope you understand at this point that that is not the case. But again, they're salvageable. So we had a massive housing boom post World War II. The country's suburban population rose about 20% from 1940 to 1960. It was at 30%. Planned communities grew at an astonishing rate of 126%. That's amazing. And that was, a lot of it was done because, you know, we had more labor, we were able to do these faster. I'm in a cookie cutter home in Niles, but my house was hand dug. So it didn't have and it was in the 50s, it was post-war. Nothing came in and scraped us. I have intact native soil in my yard, not close to my house, but this is something that I know when my house was built, so I can say, hey, here, I have native soil. So what else can we do? Where are you on the landscape? You on the top, you on the bottom, are you on a steep slope? I mean, are you trying to plant in this? If you were to dig a hole, is it going to look like that? What's below ground? Are there any constraints? You know, walk around, look at the site, see what's there. So I want you to always question what you find below fresh sod. At one point, just maybe if you can roll it back into its original roll, we have to do a little bit of work. So the Arbor Day Foundation, you know, right tree, right place. I'm going to take it a little bit further. You have to do a site assessment and possible modification remediation to better prepare these soils. All right, so really on the left is what we want. It's an ideal A horizon. You have very low runoff, high infiltration, high permeability, high pore space, and low bulk density. And everything's different on the other side. And start looking at, once trees leaf out, start looking at our trees. Really look at it through my lens. Unfortunately, a lot of our trees look like this on the right. And it's sad because the untrained eye is like, oh, that's a perfectly healthy tree. Well, the tips are dead. It looks thin. It's, you know, if I did some what I call twig elongation measurements, I can probably see that thing has stopped growing quite a few years ago. So soil compaction is the single most difficult and harmful environmental or abiotic condition that a tree or shrub can experience. Bulldozers have the effect on soil akin to that of ancient glaciers. They level and mix soil horizons and set the clock back to zero. So you take your 13,000-year-old soil, you're back to like that glacier just retreating. Urban soil restrictions tend to be more permanent and difficult to fix than chemical. A lot of people will just treat it with chemical. We'll be like, just keep putting chemicals down. That's not necessarily going to help. All right, so just keep in mind, these are not nurturing environments for trees to grow in. This is from Sharon Brock and I did this project in Chicago. We cored 180 sites throughout the whole Chicago area. You're looking at 1 meter deep. So these are very disturbed soils. You see this layer of like fill with this other layer of fill. Some of it smelled like petroleum. I mean, we were in some areas of Chicago where you knew that the site history was so old that it could have been factory soils below there with like this, fresh layer of soil on top. So when you start seeing these differences in layers, you should question the authenticity of it being native or not. So what is highly disturbed soils? It impacts the amount of water, oxygen, nutrient availability of tree roots. It impacts the physical tree root ability to grow. It impacts the amount and stability of soil organic matter, the vigor and longevity of a tree. So require site preparation. I want you to think of it, whatever number you want, but plant a $5 tree and a $50 hole. Put some more money into amending that site than the tree. Most experts agree if the soils are compact, they need to be repaired. So if you correct the physical, then the biology and the chemistry will follow. Bring the forest floor to the urban tree, not the other way around. So this is just some images of some actual nurturing environments for trees. You can see much more gradual changes throughout. Now, no abrupt changes really. This is that E horizon that I was telling you about earlier. So this is a zone. This happens more in our northern forest. This is actually from Canada. So here's from that same project that we did, Chicago Urban Forest Study. These were natural soils. You can see how different they are than those urban disturbed ones. So just to get it in, you have your ideal soils, you have higher root space, and you have your compacted soils. This is from one of our sites that we compacted and planted trees. I'll talk about it later. This was like a 50-pound chunk of soil that we excavated. It was, before that was, beautiful intact farmland. So there's these urban soils again. All right, so Dr. Kellogg was the head of the USDA when it started. And beautiful words, there can be no life without soil and no soil without life. They've evolved together. We have to continue this message. So let's talk about what we can do. The number one thing most studies have in common after doing these so I go to these talks, I listen to these experts from around the world, and it's always adding organic material. It's physically disrupting that really dense material and then adding a bunch of organics into it. Some people will be like, well, you're not supposed to amend every tree hole. I'm not suggesting after your site assessment, if you're like, these are intact natural soils, you don't need to do this. But most people don't have intact natural soils. So with that being, you don't necessarily have to do this for every tree you plant, but it's always recommended to have some sort of sponge-like substance, especially as we start altering our precipitation. Last year, massive amount of rains came in spring. And then we went like months without water. If you have the capacity to hold water like a sponge, organic matter, your trees and shrubs will do better. All right, so back to this. We have our natural soil formation. A lot of time can pass and we'll get to here. But then here we come in and we're going to develop this site. We're going to scrape all the soil off. And just by the machinery rolling over, you're compacting and compressing these sites. And you get this sad tree. So if you were so lucky to be able to get your hands on a backhoe, you can do this physically with one of these. This is large scale. This is what the contractors are doing. They're ripping it up. They're amending it with organic material. And even if they can afford it, they're importing topsoil, and they're getting a much less dense environment that maybe some things will actually enjoy living in, and you'll have a healthier tree. We can also achieve this by using just labor. So take your soil, break it apart, add your organic matter about 4 inches, physically mix it and integrate it throughout. We don't want recompaction to happen. That's when farmers till, recompaction happens, and then they have to till again, and then recompaction happens, and they get into like this death spiral of every year having to do this tillage on their fields because they're not adding organic in. So we can mix it in with our shovels, smooth it out, add mulch. This then is like a fresh palette for things to mature in and continue the process of amending this site. So some organic materials, anything that you can compost, bio solids that comes from the water reclamation facility. We've done a lot of research with it. It's not the worst stuff I've ever touched. I've also raised 2 kids though, so I'd rather have my biosolids composted like this. And then biochar, it's a trendier product. It's actually it's wood that has been gone through the process of pyrolysis. It preserves the natural structure. It's sort of like charcoal, but it's a little bit different process. It's in the lack of oxygen, and it has very high surface area, and you can't squish it. It has structure to it. So adding that, and it becomes a long-term soil carbon source. But again, we got this organic matter. So what is it? I said this all already, and I believe I put a duplicate slide in, but anyhow, the bottom message is like improved soil structure facilitates the growth of vegetation, which contributes to biomass cycling. And we're just now going to improve things over time. All right, so here's a video that I got from Davey Tree Institute. So this is untreated soil. See how much pressure he has to put on it to break it apart? So that's untreated. This is soil that's been tilled. All right, so really a lot of pressure in all different zones, all the ranges pushing it. This soil has been tilled, and then they added biochar and compost to it, and it just falls apart. I would much rather be a root growing in this than either of these two. Okay, moving on. All right, so let's go to Cornell. Very high respect for Dr. Nina Bassick. She's at the Cornell Horticulture Institute, and she plays in areas like this after construction, uses these massive clods of soil and figures out how to grow things in it. So they've had a lot of expansion on their campus. We have 3 study sites. So the blue is where they fix the soil. The red is the control right next to it where they did not fix it, so they could have a comparison site. 3 different times of disturbance at Cornell. The disturbance was big. It was entire areas as staging grounds for machinery and trucks, and then they had to go in and plant. So there's a flow chart that she goes through. She's like, so, is your subsoil compacted or topsoil? And so going through this, you'll eventually figure out like, okay, here's what we need to do. We need to put compost over the whole thing. We need to do the scoop and dump method. We need to replace topsoil. So there's lots of mechanisms to go about this, but the goal is to break it up, add organic spongy material, and then plant your plants in it. You can, for large sites, if you are so blessed as to get your hands on a backhoe, you can do it that way. But if you can get a bunch of friends and some subs and I don't know, a few cases of beer by then, you might be able to get them, convince them to do this by hand. There's a lot of success that's been done by doing this with hand. So let's look at some data, because as a scientist, I can't tell you this without showing you data. So this is the scoop and dump method, and this is the unamended site. This is your bulk density. At the unamended site, she had a bulk density of about 1.5, and the scoop and dump was just about 0.9. This is actually, these aren't the same soil types as we have here in Illinois. I can tell you ideal bulk density is about 1.1, but that's because we have clay, so it can have a little bit higher. So 1.1 is our ideal, and what we can get up to is 1.6 before trees start suffering. So you're at whatever their soil types are in Cornell, you're approaching that area of root penetration resistance happening. So what that's interesting too is over time, the years since here's when they did the scoop and dump. Over time, the soil continued to fix itself. It continued to have a lower bulk density every time they measured it, because they did the scoop and dump, they planted their plants, and then root exploration happened. It's moving on, it's getting into these environments, and it's loosening it up. So what penetration resistance is, essentially how much resistance it is to take this cone and shove it into the ground. Again, on your unamended sites, they could only get to about 2.5 inches. But in the scoop and dump, they were able to poke it down to 10 inches before hitting 300 PSI. 300 PSI is the root limiting resistance. So they got to root limiting resistance in the unamended site at a depth of like between 2 to 4 inches. And it took them to 10 inches to get that. Most of our tree roots are within the first 12 inches. This is a satisfying value to see here. All right, looking at what it does for nutrients, nitrogens are most common to pick at. It's amazing, you know, it's not rocket science. They added a bunch of organic material that has higher nitrogen in it. All right, this is just showing that they know data and how to make grass, but it's good. It's proven to have more nitrogen available to plants. Active carbon, they added a bunch of carbon. Believe it or not, they're going to have more carbon in the scoop and dump site than they are the unamended. But it's this seeing how it's changing. Let's go back to that last one. Over time, it's your potential mineralizable nitrogen is increasing. That's good. Over time, I mean, 12 years post construction after they fixed it, you are actually increasing your active carbon content. So let's look at aggregate stability. The clumps of soil aggregates of sand, silt, clay, all stuck together using the sticky glue stuff, and organic matter in both are significantly different from each other from the scoop and dump to the amended. So much higher stability aggregates, much more organic matter. I mean, you're looking at about 8%. That's substantial. That's a good amount for a plant. Water holding capacity. This is the important stuff. Much more available water. We're almost at that 25%. Whereas in the unamended, we're much lower. We have much lower ability to store water for plants to use here than we do here. Cost, of course, they analyze cost back, well, this is probably 5 years ago. It only cost them, really want a mini excavator. I see one at the Home Depot by me. I hope they don't rent it to me, but if they do, I'm gonna have so much fun. Compost depth 4, 6, 8 inches. You need to add 8 inches, so it's costing you $230 a square foot bed. That is a great investment into a tree. Some people spend $1,000 on a tree. Why wouldn't you also spend $230 on fixing the soil? So this is what they came up with. That construction site looks like this lush jungle in the middle of New York. So it's middle of the state, New York, and they have beautiful, I mean, there's the entire campus comes to this site to sit in these little quadrants of like this little reading area because you feel like you're in this forest preserve. The horticulture department's very proud of this. So Dr. Miles Sachs and Nina Bassick lent me their data and they did a great job. But there's no tree there. Let's say the tree is there and it's struggling. We identified that it's struggling and we know that it's because of the soil. What do we do now? We can incorporate amendments in the soil in the rooting zone. This is Bartlett. We've done some work with Bartlett as researchers. This is augering holes in and then we're going to fill it. This is air spading. This is what contractors can do for you. But what can you do for you as a homeowner? I saw this talk in 2019 at ISA, and it was amazing. And I said, I need your talk. And he said, thank you. I need to get this out to more people in the state. So this is vertical mulching and worm technology for long-term soil decompaction. This is a site, Stockley Park. It's in the UK. It's by their airport. It's this huge complex. It's like their Amazon center. It's their corporate headquarters. It's one of their most successful business parks. It's been around since the 80s. Over 140,000 trees were installed, all with massive issues of nutrient deprivation, drought, excess water, soil compaction, and contamination. Essentially, the artists and the designers had a little bit too much fun and funding in the buildings and the concrete. And when it came down to planting the trees, they just planted them. So you get these very sickly little things. And it's one thing if you didn't realize that they've been planted there for 20 years. So poor canopy coverage, limited stem extension, just sick. So Bartlett got contacted. And this is the soil. He pulled back mulch, had a very high pH, ideal 6.5. It was in the range of 7.1 to 8.9. Very high salinity, which is your salts, a lot of sodium in that thing. Low phosphorus, nitrogen, calcium, magnesium. The soil physical environment was sandy and silt texture, very low organic matter, extremely high compaction values. Okay, here we are, 1.8 to 2.0 grams per cubic centimeter. Bricks are 1.9 to 2.4. You are literally planting a tree in a brick. And to top it all off, they were installed too deep. So looking at those values, we know what success rates are based on bulk density. Very low success rate. He was in this area. He's at about 10%. It's not ideal. So this became a perfect trial for research, as several species were planted in blocks by the landscape architect, because that's what they like. They like neat rows of blocks of the same tree. And so it turned out to this equal study for these scientists to come in and do their work. This slide didn't work out very well, but there's all these techniques. I lost the fun thing. You can't really see this. It's called vertical trenching. It's just essentially ripping holes into it and then filling it back in with loose soil, giving roots areas to move in. Air spading, you can do the grid system. But what he was like, hey, let's look at what worms can do. Worms are soil engineers. Worms are used to moving soil around in these environments, really dense environments. They consume leaf mold, they decompose wood. Their castings are very high in nutrients. You can buy worm castings. They have a very high turnover in populations. And so that means they're also dying and adding to that carbon pool. They can improve porosity up to 400%. That's fantastic. So he used two worms. One moved mostly vertically and one moved horizontally. And he was able to, the deepest he saw a worm on excavation of a certain site was 1 meter deep. There were 20 trees that were installed, 3 species. He removed soil. Essentially what he did was he drilled holes in the ground in all of them, even the control. And then he added different amendments to it. So it was biochar got added to all the treatments, fertilizer got added to all the treatments, and mulch got added as a top dressing. The difference was clover or worms, or the clover plus worms. Clover is a nitrogen fixing plant. Pretty easy to do. So the key is worm. That's really what he was looking at. So looking at before and after, I forgot these were animated. I'm sorry. This was the site before construction, and then after they actually put a more decent crop cover over it. So looking at what the data did. So here's your initial bulk density. And this is under the canopy. This orange dot is the control. So you can see it didn't really change much. The rest of them sank. But the ones with the worms, the green, had a much lower bulk density than all the rest. So that's those little soil engineers doing their things. Down here, here's my bulk density on this axis. And this is the untreated area. This is what surprised him the most. He knew this was what it was going to look like, but as a scientist, he's like, here, I have to prove it. The worms left the treated area. And they started moving on and amending the site around it, which is where then the roots will grow. So he was like, this is fascinating because they're moving on and exploring more. And behind them in their channels will be the tree roots. So this is a visual aid where this is an untreated area. And here he was able to see the things coming out where they came out to get a little whatever worms do on the surface, get eaten by birds or something, but they left castings, they left evidence that they've actually moved away from the untreated area. That's fascinating. Dr. Glenn Percival at a Bartlett Tree Research in England gracefully gave me his talk. He's a wonderful, he's published hundreds of papers. He's a great researcher, and it's all for urban trees. All right, so here's what I've actually been involved in with Brian Scherenbrock and Gary Watson at the Arboretum. We looked at compaction remediation of urban dirt, affectionately called CRUD. The objective was to evaluate the impact of 6 surface treatments. So we looked at synthetic fertilizer, aerated compost tea, hardwood mulch, biological product, compost, and water. We looked at the chemical, physical, and biological properties on 2 species, red maple and river birch. We did this on a disturbed urban site for over 3 years. You can see this is an aerial. This is what 120 trees look like on Google Maps. Here it is on the ground. So here's a mulch plot. This is 2 meter by 2 meter. This is a fresh compost plot. So they were all treated the same. So what we did in 2007, we scraped off the topsoil. We graded the subsoil. We made sure it was at capacity, water holding capacity, because we wanted it really squishy, mushy, and degraded. Then we put topsoil back on about 3 centimeters. We spread it, and then we drilled holes in it. So if you have to drill a hole in your soil, you should probably question what you're doing right there. So just when you see these auguring things, just be like, oh, I'm so sorry, you have 12 years to live, tree. And then we planted the trees. We did plant bare root just so that way you have an idea. So this is that same picture. What happened to bulk density from the unscathed to the scathed side? We had a 24% increase in bulk density in the top like 18 centimeters. This is your 20 centimeter mark, 40 centimeter mark. You can see that we had almost 40% increase in bulk density in this subsoil zone. And this was solid polygons of soil that we were excavating out and taking out and be like, no wonder these trees in the urban environment are in such bad condition. So if you've never stood in a soil hole, it's exhilarating. I love it. It was like 5 degrees out, but you wouldn't have known it down there. So this on this side is where it was compacted, and this on this side was native. So we actually had a backhoe dig us into that sweet spot so we could turn around and look at both sides. All right, so these are all the things that I did. It was a ton of work, and it was only capable because I managed like 20 volunteers a week to do this stuff. So the fun part was every good biologist has to kill their things. So we plucked the trees out with a I forgot the name of it. And then, so we let the trees out, and then we air spaded all the soil off, and we did a lot of root stuff. So what did we look at? So bulk density. This is null, just water. Really the 2 things that we want to look at are compost and wood chips. So remember, we compacted the site, we drilled holes, we put trees in it, and we walked away, and we're like, all right, what top dressing? We're not integrating anything vertically. What can we put on top to help these trees perform best? And the answer, I'm gonna, spoiler alert, it's compost and wood chips, which is weird because that's what you would think of in the forest soils. So looking at this bulk density from the one that's only watered is greater than 1.4 grams per cubic centimeter. That's high. The compost and the wood chips are like 1.3 and 1.28. Remember, a really good quality is about 1.1 in our area. That's I would say this is after 3 years. That's substantial. Looking at these hash marks is just the amount of gravimetric soil moisture, how much water holding capacity is in that soil. Lower bulk density, look at the inverse relationship. Lower bulk density, higher capacity to hold water. It's not rocket science. Lower bulk density, much higher capacity to store water. Soil organic matter also amazingly increased with compost and wood chips. Here we have soil microbial respiration rates in the hash marks, much higher if you have higher carbon stock. Percent nitrogen, what did happen? Compost through the roof, much higher nitrogen availability to these trees than all the other ones. It's the only one that's significantly different. pH it did impact the pH, but that's what happens when you add a bunch of dead stuff. It's going to increase the pH a bit, but it's not, this is such a small difference. Phosphorus, we have much more available phosphorus in the compost, makes sense. It's dead dying things. phosphorus is part of a big part of that nutrient pool. So what did it do to health and diameter growth? So there's two different trees, right? We have our solid bar, which are the maples, hash bars, which are the birch. So looking at our treatments, water, mulch, compost, compost tea, and this other product. What happens with the two? The relative change in diameter. Look at what happened to our birch. Our birches grew tremendously well, and these are so overplanted. They're beautiful trees. They're used so much in the urban landscape in terms of your little front yard, your birch, your three, little shrubs next to it. Well, if you have these degraded soils and if you put some mulch on it, could you imagine if you put mulch and compost in one, you'd have a super tree versus just having water. So we were able to see treatment differences in the health of the tree, because all the other data was looking at soil. All right, so here's looking at tree biomass. This line represents the soil. This is all above ground biomass, below ground biomass. Much more biomass in the wood chip plots than in the null, which is the water. There's a difference in this letter to that letter. So there's a significant difference in that too. So the wood chips actually put out more biomass below ground. It's able to get into these areas and grow bigger and have more volume to it. It's doing the same above ground. So you should always question yourself if you drill a hole in the ground, because you have to drill it and then it fills with water and doesn't drain for like a week. This was excavated 5 years out from install, and you can see it hit the edge of one of it and just spun around. And this is actually on display in one of the labs right now. And if you're like, I hate data's stupid, I like pictures. Here's me, I'm 5'6". This is a birch and this is a birch. They were planted from the same size stock. They are 15 feet away from each other. This one has been watered. This one's under mulch. That's substantial. So I really want to thank Bryant Scherenbrock and Gary Watson. This paper is very well referenced, but what it did was it raised another question. So on one of the days of us excavating these trees and just killing these things, Bryant came up to me, he's like, take a picture of my hands. And I was like, holy crap, what is this massive soil? I was like, where did you find that? And he goes, that was under the mulch. And this was under the compost. And I was like, this is alarming. And he's like, yes, I know. We think it has to just do with the amount of moisture, that those trees were just like at the capacity of being able to pull moisture in, but it didn't really do much for the aggregates. So, we need to use a combination treatment. So, we almost have a structureless environment right here, whereas this is structured and granular. So why do we think that is? We have these primary and secondary successions that are happening. So primary is when we are down to bare earth, like time equals 0. Secondary succession happens after like fires or something really disruptive, but it doesn't necessarily impact below ground. So you're a little bit off at primary succession, you're about 100 years out. Secondary succession, within 100 years, you're at a good community. This is what we're seeing at, I'm gonna mess that up, but a lot of these volcanic eruptions take you to here, but in the blast zones, you get down to here. So you could go to, was it Yellowstone? No, somebody blew their top in the 80s. You can see both this primary and secondary happening like side by side. And it's amazing to see the difference in plant community responses like 40 years later. So what is happening? What's the first thing that comes in? It's these forbs. It's these deep rooting plants, high nitrogen fixation, high turnover. They set seeds. They're prolific. They're constantly turning over. Well, what we have coined that as a fancy term is companion plantings. So we do a lot with, but the community is doing a lot with sedges under oaks, and they're helping each other. So by planting a plant under a tree, you could further develop that soil horizon. So daikon radish. If you have really bad soil and you're like, man, I really got to get this thing going, it's a annual. You throw some seed down, it'll drill into it and then it dies. So dandelions aren't the worst thing that has ever happened either. If you have a dandelion, it means you have disturbed soils. It means you have compacted soil. It is an indicator plant. So by pulling it and ignoring it, you're just going to keep getting dandelions. So by letting the dandelions finish their process of decompacting the soil, in theory, you should have less dandelions. So in, healthy soils for urban trees, we need to reduce our bulk density above to improve our above and below ground function, which relates to health and growth. We need to incorporate organic matter. There's strong peer-reviewed evidence in reducing compaction by the addition. We can reduce our compaction with organics to improve soil quality. It also improves structure, water holding capacity, infiltration, permeability, nutrient capacity, and exchange. And at the end, we get to have healthy, long-lived trees, shrubs, perennials, whatever your jam is. A healthier soil is going to get you a much better plant. So I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, email me. Within reason, I can get you to the right person or try and figure it out for you.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle.
You're
I
muted.
feel like I am back in grad school. This was awesome. We have a couple of really great questions here.
I can't hear you.
Is it your volume? Did you turn your volume? I know you were having issues.
Was my volume down really low?
I could hear you fine. Can you hear me okay?
Now I can.
Okay, perfect.
Keeps wanting to go to my headphones, which aren't even plugged in. These computers are so smart.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Okay, so we had a couple of really great questions right at the end there. You really answered this one, but I kind of want to drive this one home because I really like it. One person asked, I heard conflicting advice on under tree plantings. Is it okay to plant shade-loving plants under a tree, or are they taking nutrients and water from the tree?
Right. So that's one of those where, if you want nothing growing under the tree, you have to mulch it. Bare soil is the worst thing you can have. So now if you're managing this tree and it's your house and it's your love, you love gardening, go ahead, plant things under it. Just know that you may need to water deeper during these, drought cycles. Middle of August, I see no reason with letting that hose just trickle over even 100-year-old tree. So doing plantings under a tree is not an issue if you can water it and maintain it.
Now, the other issue that I've heard is grass. Because the roots of grass, just your regular lawn grass, are so shallow, those I've heard will compete more with tree roots than something like native plants that have those longer roots that are going to go down farther than the tree's roots and therefore have less of an impact. Is that
Absolutely.
accurate?
Absolutely. There's a graphic on our website somewhere. It shows it was a soil core taken below mulch and below turf of a tree. And then they excavated all the roots from it, cleaned them, washed them, put them side by side. And there was like 5 times the amount of tree roots under the mulch than there was under the grass.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of competition in that turf to maintain its green luster. And that's the thing why herbaceous plants will do better, because they have more of a willingness to give than turf.
True. Somebody else asked, what about mycorrhizal communities? And this question was posted when you were talking about what is it? Not dig and dump. It's
Scoop and dump.
Scoop and dump. Thank you.
Yep.
So does that disturb the mycorrhizal communities too much, or does it not?
If you're in a highly degraded soil, chances of having healthy mycorrhizae doesn't exist. That network would have already been disrupted. They're in the top. So when I worked for the new researcher, Dr. Megan Midgley, she's more of a soil ecologist. Most of the stuff we were seeing was in the top 10 centimeters. So you're looking at about 8 inches. So if you are intact topsoil, yes, you would disrupt it. But then you have to ask yourself, what's my long-term goal here? Because that mycorrhizae, the spores are there, it's there. It can recover much easier than a woody tree root. So you kind of have to have this give or take. Those spores are everywhere. If you feel as if it's really hard to find a soil that has nothing in it, once you start giving it the nutrient, the nurturing part of it, you'll recover that a lot. So yeah, you can disrupt it, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself, what's more important, the tree or this network that is just going to quickly reform?
So along those lines, how can a homeowner affordably encourage the decompaction of their own soils?
So I would do this, that pitchfork scoop and dump. So you put it in, you pull it apart, put it in, pull it apart, throw some compost on top of it, wiggle it in, and that is allowing it to not recompact. So you've added your little spongy layer between it, and then over time, you're going to start building that. What is your land use? Is it turf that you want to decompact? Well, maybe you don't want to decompact turf because then it'll grow longer. It'll grow faster. You'll have to mow it more. Maybe compacted turf soil is ideal, but in your backyard where it's like your lush oasis, certainly have less compacted soil. So, in some situations, maybe compacted soil is okay if you don't want to mow so much, but then you don't have we're looking at where do we store all this excess rainwater? We need to store it in our soils. We cannot store it on land. We cannot store it in retention ponds. We should be responsible for our own rainwater, and you do that by having decompacted soils.
Excellent. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. We had a couple similar ones. So for existing trees, how should people incorporate the compost and the mulch? You pull the mulch back, compost, push the mulch back over. How would you do that?
When we were putting the mulch on that field plot, we put it on about 50% application rate. So let's simplify that and say it was 2 5-gallon buckets dumped in a 15 by 15 foot area. You rake it in with like with a rigid fork. Within 2 weeks, you don't even notice it's there. It has worked its way in, and then the fine particles start working its way through. This is a slower involvement. So, but what you're doing is you're just then the grass will kind of grow up through it. Within very short time, you won't even notice that you put a bunch of stuff on it. You could do that with the biosolids as well. That stuff breaks down really fast. If there is mulch there, just go ahead. Sometimes your mulch gets into that wad of weird stuff. Flip it over. You might actually see mycorrhizae on the bottom of that. If you do, that means they're trying really hard to eat that mulch. That is a sign that you're actually reducing nutrients to the soil because those microbes are trying to eat that wood. So now what you've done is you've taken those microbes that are typically doing things for the tree, they're trying to just eat that wood. So if you put compost on top of the mulch and just kind of rake it in, again, you wouldn't really even notice it was there.
And then about what sort of radius around the tree should you have that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Tree roots expand like 3 times out from the canopy. So if your canopy is constantly being hacked back, your roots are not being hacked back. They're extending out. Most of your feeder roots are in the top like 6 inches. It depends on the size of the tree. It depends on the rate of compaction. It depends on how disturbed it is. There's what we have noticed that tree roots, they'll go under sidewalks and they'll get these breakout zones. So they're actually exploring areas with higher quality. They're trying to find higher quality soils that have what they need. So obviously the further you can do, the better. But in reality, if you could give it drip line, so you figure out where your drip line is, if you can fix that, you're going to do much better for that tree.
All right. How about leaf mulch? Is that effective under trees as well?
Oh, absolutely. It's just something that was never in our gauntlet of trying to prove to contractors. So that was what it is. It's like, hey guys, this is what you should be doing. So absolutely, leaf mulch. I think it's a great material. You can make it yourself. Add that, make this magical mixture and put it down.
Okay, this one is kind of a near and dear question to my heart. Jan wants to know, what does filter fabric, aka the weed control fabric, do to the soil? When I pulled up the filter fabric, the soil underneath it seems very compacted and dry. I hate this stuff with the fire of 1,000 burning suns.
It is effective at reducing roots or reducing weeds. Why is that?
Until it's not.
Right. Why is that? It's because there's no communication, right? It's reduced your communication. So, yeah, I've noticed that we've put it in, we've taken it out, and it's just like, it looks like that, like you're just like somebody drove over it a lot. I don't think that this is the group that would get upset if I said just don't use it, right? There's contractors that are like, we need
Definitely.
to use it.
Definitely.
Yeah, you've separated, and then they're two separate entities. They're not communicating. That translocation of nutrients, the redistribution of nutrients, things being exchanged. I mean, in a forest setting, what you're going to have is that's called coarse woody debris. That's the fancy word for like all the pieces on the ground. Well, those pieces get smaller over time and they become microscopic and they go into the soil. That is not happening with those barriers. So
yeah, and I find they actually create that sort of that layer on the surface. So now you get weeds growing into the fabric that are even now more difficult to pull out.
Right. Well, you also want to go down that rabbit hole. Then you should also make sure you match the correct hardwood type. So this red painted mulch is pine. You're putting pine on your hardwoods. That never happens in nature. The microbes that would decompose that compost, they don't even have it in their DNA to go at this pine mulch. So now you have this completely incompatible, we'll take away the fabric layer, fine, but you have this incompatible ecosystem here. So like we need to use materials that more closely resemble the forest type we're using. If you have a pine forest in your back 40, go ahead, put chip pellets on it.
That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't actually heard about that before, but of course it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, we can go, that's a whole different talk. Like
oh, I bet.
Endomycorrhizae, arbuscular mycorrhizae, and whether it's an evergreen or deciduous, things file into different categories. So, yeah.
So Patsy wants to know, does the use of pesticides on lawns affect soil and tree health?
Yeah, I mean, you're killing the microbes, you're killing it. People love their lawns. I'm at the point where I'm willing to take what I can. So, you have this battle and you're like, I'm going to go for little victories. And it's like, put some mulch on the tree. Like if I can get the tree properly planted, no stem girdling roots, it looks like it's going to outlive the 12 years and it's mulched. I spray whatever you have to, try to keep it away from the tree, keep your drift down. But I mean, we're in this together. So I can only I can only win so many battles. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, I get that. So Teresa wants to know, how do you remediate clay soils? I know I have incredibly heavy clay soils. I tried planting some shrubs 2 years ago, and I was just getting out what felt like shovelfuls of clay every time I dig.
So changing the texture of a soil is really hard to do without fully excavating, importing. That's expensive. You've actually just moved the problem deeper. It's better to just plant things that should go on higher clay content. That's that right plant, right soil. So if you understand your soil, you know it, you go through that field method and you're like, oh, I have very gritty, sandy soils. Congratulations, you have a higher palette to choose from than most people. But to have a successful planting, you just have to understand your site and you have to understand that it's best to just, why fight it, go with it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, one last question here, and then I know I've kept you all past our hour, but this has been really, really a fascinating discussion here. Rubber mulch. I know that's a new thing that's come up a lot. I've seen it on playgrounds.
Mhm.
Someone right down the street from me has replaced rock with this rubber mulch. What does that do to the soil?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a rubber, it's a petroleum-based material. Obviously, everything leaches. You're probably slowly contaminating that soil. So in these areas that build tires, they become Superfund sites.
Right.
So you're like a mini Superfund site. They have, they're bouncy. They're good for playgrounds where kids are falling 8 feet. I'd rather them bounce than, crack their head open. But we just went to Firestone the other day, the facility, and outside was their fancy wood rubber mulch. Fine, have it there. Just
Yeah.
keep it at the source. Don't put it in your yard.
That has been my advice to folks too, for exactly those reasons. It leaches, and you even smell it when they bring it. I mean, it's great that the tires are being recycled, but
Right.
this is maybe not the best use for it.
No.
So, all right, that is all we have time for. I want to thank you, Michelle, for coming out tonight, for joining us and having this wonderful soil discussion. This has been a lot of fun. And I want to thank you who are attending for joining us for the last 2 years. And this is going to be me signing off now. So like I said, webinars will continue, not to worry. We've got webinars lined up at least through May, and we'll see what happens after that. But somebody else will be taking over. It just won't be me. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great night. Good night, everybody.